interest also from the IOG ecosystem for something like that, and yeah.
Yeah, by the way, thank you very much, Yoram, for reminding this. We should invite input-output, I think, again, more specifically, Mihaela. She was asking regarding our meetings and development.
Yeah, definitely we need to send her an update. I mean, there's a lot of great things that we progressed, including the first donation cycle, the reporting of that. So definitely we need to send her.
Cool.
Yeah, I think after when we finish the white paper, we can invite her. We have a little left for the white paper.
Okay, well, I went through that presentation you sent me. I'm just looking at the Miro board at the moment. But I mean, there's a lot I could talk about in the subject, so and lots of different areas. So it's like what sort of things did you have, and perhaps do people want to know sort of roughly what I'm currently working on? The big thing, because it is very much related to all of this. Yeah,
I think it'd be great for the context.
Okay,
yeah.
Right. Just I'll give a short sort of context. So, as Yoram mentioned, I'm sort of spending a lot of time in a market mechanisms with a particular focus on things like bonding curves. So these are quite a different approach to doing a token drop. The core idea here is that somewhat like automated market makers that you would expect from DEXs, so decentralized exchanges. However, unlike doing a big token drop and then expecting to have to create a market, like say through Sunday Swap, or mini swap or whatever comes along, the bonding curve actually has its own market built into it. And the tokens for a given project are created on demand and notionally burnt on demand as well. So essentially you could take a reserve currency such as ADA, buy a given, say a Littlefish token, for example, that would be minted on demand. And when someone wants to sell it or get rid of it, it gets burnt. The bonding curve, the name in the curve, is just a mathematical relationship between the two. So if you're familiar with any of the sort of liquidity provider type of architectures for DEXs, there's always like a constant product or a constant sum sort of relationship between two tokens, and the price is automatically determined. So that's the notion of an automated market maker. The difference between a bonding curve and a generic automated market maker is that there's no real need for a liquidity provider, because the bonding curve mechanism just takes care of that for you. So that means in many respects you can attach a bonding curve to all sorts of things. One of the things I might just step back for is the notion of price. What people tend to think about at the moment when we think about tokens is kind of digital money. It's better to somewhat think about them as value stores, and therefore any sort of price is essentially converting or providing a ratio between two value stores. So they don't necessarily have to represent money. They can represent other forms of information, and we're just saying, hey, these two things are equivalent at this ratio. So that is the case for any sort of token, whether we choose to give it money-like properties or whether we just say this is represents some bundle of value, and we're trying to work out what the two represent. So that means things like bonding curves can be attached and put into all sorts of different types of to capitalize what we're doing or fund what we're doing. We can use it for other purposes to create effectively, the idea here is that generally a market, like a financial market, for example, or markets generally, are actually computational systems. And that is that they process information in a distributed and decentralized environment to work out the flows of information. So that's the position I take on what a market is. We just are more familiar with the notion of a financial market being the likes of Wall Street and other sort of areas. But the basic idea is they process information in a decentralized and distributed environment. Sebastian might be able to add in a bit more from an economics point of view, but I hope he's nodding with that, that description. That's very much the notion of a market from Hayek's point of view, and some more broadly the Austrian school. But it's also very much the view that Alan Ostrom takes within the notion of a common pool resource management. So I do a lot of my work is directly inspired by the notions of institutional economics. So that's people such as Coase, Ronald Coase, Alan Ostrom, Donald North, Oliver Williamson, and a whole bunch of other people within this idea of how do we do social choice. This means that things like markets can be used for making decisions, and that's a core idea that goes through. So we've got kind of a lot of the discussion at the moment focuses on making decisions through voting. And likely, if you've heard me talk before, you'll hear that I often sort of say, if you have to resort to voting, you've failed in governance as a sort of poll mix sort of decision. That is because you've failed to reach consensus. Most of governance is actually about deliberation and coming to some form of consensus. If you fail to achieve consensus, then you end up into the voting situation. That's not to say things like voting aren't important. They can be really, really useful in certain cases. The difference between something like, say, voting and price is that largely in a social choice environment, such as voting, you don't have the pricing function, you just have preferences. People reveal their preferences and they throw them up, and we try and have to rank and try and order things based on that. Whereas the pricing function is people reveal their preferences through the pricing function, which is aggregating all their information to come up with a consensus. Okay. So taking those sort of things together, the primary tool that I'm focusing on in terms of market mechanisms is something called a risk-adjusted bonding curve. You might have seen it mentioned in some places. I was working on something called TORHA, which is a social investment, environmental and social investment approach, and I was working on some market mechanism designs for that. When I finished up there, I came upon some work that IXO was doing, and specifically the work of Shruti Appiah, who's now the head of engineering at IOG. And so she has designed this thing called a risk-adjusted bonding curve. It's quite an exotic type of instrument. But it's also, what's really good about this is Shruti's done all the economic design. So they've taken a tool known, this is coming out of what's referred to now as the Token Engineering Group. And what she's done here, and the team from Block Science have actually come up with the requirements of an economic market mechanism and studied it, and given a whole lot of modeling associated with it using a tool called CAD-CAD, which stands for Complex Adaptive Computer-Aided Design Tool. So if any of you are familiar with multi-agent systems or systems dynamics, this is the sort of thing that is used here to try and design an economic mechanism. And by that we mean an economic mechanism is basically a system whereby you have independent agents with intent, so selfish actor, that type of thing. They have their own intent, and the intentions can change. They fulfill certain roles and we coordinate them through the pricing function. So in the case of the risk-adjusted bonding curve, there's multiple roles. There's a role of the speculator, there's a role of the proposer, there's a role of a team, and there's a role of a sponsor, and there's a role of an expert. And what we're trying to do is bring those all together so that they achieve a certain outcome that we've designed, whatever that might be. So Shruti has designed this quite a sophisticated little market mechanism, and we're implementing it in Plutus is what I'm currently working on. The type of instrument this is in finance is referred to as a conditional financing. So if you've ever come across the notion of a social impact bond, that's what this kind of implements. And so this means that it only pays out on success, whatever success is. And this little device can actually be used in a lot of places where you're trying to fund grassroots activities. And whatever anywhere where there's sort of, we need to put up like a Kiva, if you're trying to do a decentralized Kiva or any of those sort of things, then you can use it for that. In fact, I've proposed and put up a fund thing inside of Fund 7 to actually put it at the heart of Catalyst itself. So that's the retroactive funding. So another name for conditional finance is retroactive funding, and they're particularly good for public and public goods funding and common goods funding. Okay. So with that, I'd sort of leave it, and because I could go on for quite a while.
Can I have a question? First of all, I warned you before, guys, that Robert knows so much. I mean, so I warned you, and I'm happy that it's recorded, so we can come back to that. And I don't know if you understood everything. I'm not sure I understood everything, but although I heard it several times. I have one question. You said it's like a social bond model, but social bond doesn't necessarily pay retroactively, right? I mean, or like green bonds or social bonds. I mean,
right. So one of the problems. One of the problems with the social impact bond and related financial products where they're actually really heavy to negotiate. And so you've got basically this idea of search, negotiation, monitoring and auditing that's associated with COSA's transaction cost theories. And the problem with social impact bonds is that it's really, really heavy on all four of those sort of side of things. So typically only governments and large capital resources were used to do them because going in and trying to find your partners, first of all, that you were going to negotiate with were problematic. Then you have to obviously negotiate all the contracts and how this bond was going to operate, and then you needed to monitor and audit it. The argument here within the structure of the risk-adjusted bonding curve, which I can go into, is actually the market mechanism itself tries to coordinate those different functions in a lightweight way so that it actually can function at a much lower rate. So there's nothing to stop me for example, saying this is for a project for $10,000 US versus $10 million US. The market mechanism should operate in the same function. There's probably, because it relies on speculation to help fund projects, there's probably a lower bound in terms of the amount that it would support. So in principle, it could go down to like $100. In practice, people may not speculate enough at that range.
Okay. And you also spoke about Kiva and that it can adjust the Kiva type model. We know that Kiva, one of the challenges with Kiva, I mean, that you feel as a person that you are donating directly to an organization, directly to someone, but it's not actually the case, right? It goes to Kiva, then it goes to a bank, that then give it for interest to local entrepreneurs. So trying to think how to adjust this donation process directly, somehow, how does it fit that model? If it makes sense to the question.
So Kiva and similar sort of microfinance sort of environments, again, have a very similar financial supply chain or deal flow associated with what's coming through. So often, they're working through quite a number of intermediaries because they're basically trying to prep the proposals that need to be funded, the loans, those sort of things. They're trying to find the people, make them aware of that. And then there's this whole cost of monitoring and auditing them. Plus, you've also got the issue of how do you actually get the money, in this case, to the people concerned, especially when they don't have bank accounts and those sort of things. I don't think any of that necessarily goes away with tools like blockchains or even the risk-adjusted bonding curve. What they are doing are lowering that and enabling probably local organizations much closer to local communities than sort of the abstract kind of model that's going on at the moment, and all the various long chains that are associated with it. What it does do, obviously, with a blockchain is that we've got veracity. We can hook in the associated activity to try and reduce the auditing and monitoring costs associated with activities. That requires the need to structure the information quite appropriately in a way that it can be more easily monitored and audited, largely by machines. If we have to put too many people in the mix in terms of trying to manage the data that's coming through, you've immediately constructed an environment that requires more intermediaries and therefore ticketing the fees and some degree of auditing, opaqueness goes on as a result.
For me, you said just now one of the most important things probably, which is the auditing, transparency and traceability, right, of the auditing. If you're able to reduce that cost and make it more available to investors, you make the system more efficient and less costly. Which is more or less what I'm trying to work towards, is to do that. Which is because if we actually, my view here, my position generally is this, is that climate and social inequality is a failure of humans to coordinate effectively and allocate their resources, society's resources. Now that may translate to money. If you say that the popular notion of money, probably not, but if you take it from a sociological definition, that money is actually claim on society, then that makes a lot of sense. We're trying to allocate society's resources to people around the world, and we're failing to do that because of a failure to coordinate our activities around doing that. So if we can increase the ability to coordinate effectively, then we're got a better chance to solve the two grand challenges, so to speak, of what we've got. Within both of those, social or environmental change, we've got an issue of how do we measure and report? Because if we want to move large swathes of capital that are out there and being pulled, then we've got to give them transparency into how that's been allocated. So a broad term here, in financial markets, we're used to the notion of return on investment. An equivalent one within the impact space is basically additivity, the term additivity. Which basically means if I'm pumping $1 in to make this change, is that change actually going to add impact? If it isn't, I might as well not have put the $1 in, right? Because it would have just happened anyway. So the notion of additivity is equivalent to the notion of return on investment or profit with respect to typical models. And the only way you can do that is through data. Yeah, and I will add one thing also you work a lot in, which is very relevant for us, is the multi-layer accounting, right? So how the accounting of financial return, but accounting also of impact on nature and social, which is very relevant for us for our discussion, because we want to generate back an NFT with the impact, with the impact that the money actually created. So you get $5.
Well, I'll briefly explain that sort of stuff, and because this can be another whole session on, believe me, it can be a really long session on just on this area of multi-capital accounting. So first of all, the short story is this, is that at the moment, if it doesn't appear on an income statement, it's not visible. Okay, so let's just say blanket sort of thing. So we have, at the moment, we have notions of income and profit and those sort of things within the accounting practice. My broad stick is this: if you want to change the world, change accounting. Because accounting is the profession of value measurement. Okay, and how do we do that? We don't go in and say, hey, get rid of profit, which is, I see a lot going around, because profit is a measure of progress. Okay, so we still need those sort of things. We still need the notion of progress. We still need a profit, of income, and a whole bunch of other things. But the problem with it is that it uses a scalar. Right? It just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So everything in a complex world basically gets compressed down into the scalar metric of profit and turns up on the income statement. Right? So the idea here is largely to change accounting, or the idea of profit or income or anything else like that, to account for multiple dimensions of value, so that we can try and reduce externalities and related concerns like that. Now, this is not a foreign concept. The New Zealand government, my government, basically has what's known as the Wellbeing Framework. All government agencies are required to report over 4 capitals. So we're one, well, as far as I know, the first country in the world to actually do that in terms of government agency reporting. Problem is, it's still a bit, hand wavy in terms of how you do the translations into your 3 other capitals. But this is not even within business. It's not unusual. We have financial capital, we have built or manufactured capital, such as physical property, and we have intellectual capital. Over the last 20 years, intellectual capital has gained in terms of popularity on the income statement. What we're arguing here in a popular sort of narrative of 6 capitals is that we also bring in human, social, and environmental capital, right? And we measure those in certain different ways. A capital that can be used as a proxy for environmental stuff is things like carbon credits and those sort of things, but it doesn't have to be. Now, so that means that we can do those sort of things. The challenge has always been in a multi-capital accounting is the limited capacity of the pink porridge here that's in our minds. But of course, what we've got now is we've got machines that can process numbers really, really quickly and do things. So there's a desire to do that. I think we've got the technology to do that. We just haven't got the practice. One of the key things, of which I'll leave on this last point, is that out of all the blockchain systems that I'm aware of, Cardano is the only one that defines value as a vector. It natively supports multi-capital accounting or bookkeeping natively. So that is basically an output within a transaction is designed as a token bundle. Okay, so it literally is defined, and in the specifications defined as a vector space, which means that it natively supports multi-capital accounting. There's no special need there to make it do its magic. The only thing you need to do is to introduce the ideas of ratios into managing the relationship between those bundles of tokens. So you can do those sort of things. But I could talk a lot about this. And the core idea here is that you're actually trying to represent value in a richer form than a single number does. A single number that is anchored in a fiat or nation sovereign account.
Do you follow the work of Joseph Stiglitz?
Yeah, so Joseph, well, actually, the work of Michael Elderman actually is more relevant here. He used to work for Joseph Stiglitz. And he's done quite a bit of work on bringing a mathematical basis to accounting. It's referred to as property theory. And some work here has built upon that by the work of Roger Willett, Michael Fay, not Michael Fay, I can never pronounce his last name, Michael Farr or something, and Federico Buffotto have extended that further to give it a much solid basis. And they're all based here in New Zealand.
Good. So amazing. I don't know, again, if, I mean, we want to take it into a little bit to the Littlefish now context. And I don't know if someone wants to give feedback, remarks, questions.
Yes,
I know it's a,
I
yeah,
have a
please,
question.
Sebastian. Yeah.
Thank you. So concretely, if we try to apply this to a project, for example, like Littlefish, would be creating bonding curves specifically for each of the projects that are trying to get funded using our platform, or will it be just one bonding curve for the entire ecosystem of projects?
It would be many. The idea is you instantiate as many as you need when you need them.
If some of those fall below the profitability or speculation threshold, will declare them failed projects or inactive?
So there's a number of ways. The parameters to a given bonding curve can be varied. So a curve could be, for example, a linear curve if that was required. The conditions upon, in the case of the risk-adjusted bonding curve, it pays out on success. So you have to sort of decide what is success. That's an open question, which largely boils into how do you value and measure the outcomes. Failure is a little easier to define. That basically is the inverse, which is, well, if you haven't declared success, then you, by the time the curve matures, the bond matures, then you've failed. So that's a relatively easy one. So a good framing to think about these sort of things, Sebastian, is basically as a type of, well, a type of fixed income instrument. As so if you're doing any sort of treasury corporate paper, those sort of things have got similar sort of measurement criteria, but you've just lowered the cost down.
Now, implementing this, will we depend on your research of implementing this on Bluetooth, or?
So we've been funded in Fund 6 to do some of the initial implementation, which we're working on now. The aim, so for you guys, in terms of where you're at, the bonding curve's not ready. Let's be clear about that. This is something that's going to be market ready in, say, 12 months in terms of use and all the other sort of infrastructure. It's a little more complicated to implement than your standard DEXs or any of the loan protocols or those sort of things. So we're working on that now. We're also making it a little bit harder for us because we're actually doing all the formal methods and specification work, because basically I want to make sure this thing is built properly. If you're going in to try and fund someone in Ghana or in Indonesia or Vietnam, the last thing you want to have is to destroy their expectations and their livelihood, that sort of thing. So you want to make sure that it's really robust. It's okay if someone does a rug pull in a speculative market where people are just doing token flipping, but I do not want that to happen in what we're doing here. So the engineering of this is more extreme than your typical approach. Okay. And but there's also in Fund 7, and I don't know whether it will get funded or not because it's about the third time it's gone up. The idea of a bonding curve is kind of not, well, it's not familiar at the moment. So there's been one proposal which is just doing a bonding curve SDK, not the risk-adjusted bonding curve, but just a simple, relatively simple bonding curve SDK where you could specify the parameters for the bonding curve that you wanted to create. You instantiate that, you could plug that into whatever you're building, and away you go. That is actually the basis for the risk-adjusted bonding curve, but that work hasn't been funded, and it's been put up 3 times and is unlikely to be funded in Fund 7 as well. So yeah, that's okay.
Keep positive, keep positive. In a few days,
that's all right. I mean, we still have to do it anyway, to be honest, because it's just I won't put the effort into making it clean and tidy as a useful SDK at this point in time.
Robert, I have another question. How do you, sorry if you want to terminate, sorry. How do you approach a tokenization model for a new project? What will your approach to start thinking about tokenization, if at all? How would you approach
largely where a lot of you would start is using tools such as the business model canvas or related tools like that. There's also probably a better one in the case of Littlefish, is the platform design toolkit. And just these are analysis and communication tools to help you think about the types of transactions, the roles people are playing, what sort of things you want to do. They're a communication device that enables people from different backgrounds to come in together and try and design what it is you're trying to achieve. And from that, you would then start to formalize your token models in what you're doing. Now, you could, me being me, I would go off and start working in CAD-CAD, which is a Python-based toolkit hooked into Jupyter notebooks to do your visualizations and your explorations. But you take it from your business model canvases and that sort of community discord. This is what we're trying to achieve. These are the roles. These are the sort of incentives we think we've got. Now let's try and refine that design a little bit more with code in terms of simulations and things like that. And then you would go down and do the implementation and things like Haskell and front-end tools and whatever you're going to use there, React or whatever. On that side of things. So this is quite different, and this is true of what the bonding curve enables, as opposed to, say, just doing a token drop. If you're doing a token drop, your only real requirement to think about at this stage is a lot easier, because all you're doing is effectively working out the broad stroke allocations. 24% to the founding team, 60% of the community, those sort of things. And then you're constructing a narrative around it. Whereas if you actually start to look at what you're trying to do, what communities you're trying to serve, what types of transactions you want to use, then things like the business model canvas, or more specifically, the platform design kit, is really relevant there. I'll put that in. I take it, have people been familiar with the platform design kit?
Yeah, that is the tool that I shared with the team last week, I think.
Yeah. There's also, in terms of good design, I would also argue that you could look at doing things like using serious games. There's a few serious games out there where you can actually play, given these rules that we're coming up with, play a game and see if it works. And this is just a simple sort of board game and stuff like that. And from that, everyone starts to learn and understand how the token dynamics are going to occur. Right? And so these are just essentially design, analysis, and research tools to help you.
So I'd like to go one step further. As we design it, as we build the ecosystem, at least on paper, and we start implementing these with smart contracts, I'm trying to figure out a process where we can do it incrementally, because in the end, we'll have an ecosystem that'll be composed of many smart contracts and the token and the interactions between those smart contracts. And we're creating an economy where we're defining all those interactions. Is there a method of developing this piece by piece, that in the end it makes sense? Or do we have to, like, in some way just create it all at once, go live all at once?
So the best practice in terms of doing this is coming out of the Token Engineering Commons. They're aligned. Obviously, they've got to focus on Ethereum, but that's where CADs come from. So what I've outlined in terms of like using something like the business model canvas and then playing serious games and then going into something like CAD and doing your engineering and stuff around that is about going through that incremental process and understanding how your different mechanisms will interact with what you're trying to choose to do. Okay, so that's it will both help you understand how to design these systems more broadly in a way that they're aligned with the community of what you're trying to help, who you're trying to help. So going into, say, Plutus engineering is kind of your last step in all of that, because by then you've probably got a really, really good understanding of how this market mechanism or these token mechanisms work and how they're going to fit together, and implementing them then becomes the kind of final step. And by then, and indeed this is the work I'm trying to do with what we're doing in the risk adjusted bonding curve, which is a big reason why I've also tried to minimize the amount of work required and just picked up where Shruti had left off, is how do you take something from a CAD design and map that through into the underlying Plutus code. And so we're using something known as, at different levels of formalism, we're starting with something called bigraphs, which I won't go into, but then, so we're doing the bigraph work, that's giving us a pretty good formal specification. That's then being mapped down into actual model checking code, which is we're using something called a Marada to do that. And then out of that, we're getting the Plutus code and the AGDA code associated with it in terms of, so we can do the mechanical proofs. And then, you know, we're effectively writing the Plutus code. So there's quite a few steps. That's extreme. But as I said to you before, there's an ethical engineering question that I'm building stuff that society or civil society will use. I don't want it to fall out of the sky. Is a rough approximation. Okay. So Dimitri, you got some questions there. So Dimitri, did you want to pull up your answer, ask your question here?
Yeah, it's about kind of long term, I think, project using the profit, particular app to constantly increase outputs. So Dimitri, you want to ask the question directly from what's in your mind?
Basically, which particular technology or system could be used on the blockchain to constantly increase one's revenue, one's profit, in order to use that profit to do a project like building a children's home every month. So is there any input that you can share? It's not directly relevant to this, but since you're here, I thought I'd ask.
There is. It is somewhat relevant because one of the aims within what we're doing on the risk adjusted bonding curve work is to make sure that it works for things like stake pools. This is a way for, in particular, mission-orientated stake pools to get a foot up over just the pure sort of high returns. Again, you know, data becomes really important because what we're asking people to do is forego a financial return and what's sometimes referred in the industry as a blended return. So it's blending impact with financial returns. And mission-orientated pools are trying to do that at the moment, but in a way which is unaccountable. So here, stake pools have a revenue source in a competitive market, but we want to be able to say, well, actually, we're doing good. We're doing our mission. And what we'll do in terms of designing this thing is that we've got some of our profits will go into these various different projects, risk-adjusted bonding curves, and we'll get the accountability and the auditability going on. So that's a way for, like in your case, Dimitri, say, for example, the biodiversity in Sri Lanka or whatever, is to set up stake pools there. But now, instead of a wish or a declared statement, it's now actually auditable, and you can see where the profits are going. Because you've got more transparency in what's going on and happening there.
So in other words, what you're saying is, in order to constantly, we'll say, bring
Dimitri? Yeah, we lost him.
Yeah.
I think we lost Robert and Dimitri at the same time,
Yeah,
right?
Robert seems
Yeah.
frozen as well.
So much knowledge, huh? We need to, there is exam in the end, huh? So
Yeah, we have to do so much things.
It is today, I'm gonna fail.
yeah, there's so much knowledge. I mean, we need to understand the.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, Dimitri,
Yes.
but Robert fall.
Yeah, so what I was
Multi-capital
saying, what Robert is saying is that stake
Am I
pools
back
will
now?
be able to.
That's good. I must have dropped off.
Yep.
I did.
So Robert,
Yeah,
what
half
you're
of the
saying
world
is that
dropped off.
stake pools can provide the financing, and your risk-adjusted bonding curve will help them to have more confidence in providing financing to a project like this, which every month will need more and more and more.
Right. So that's a key point here that we raised earlier around the role of data and auditability. If you take, for example, how financial markets work at the moment, in 1889 or whenever it was, Reuters came up with the idea of the standard annual report. All right. This then enabled companies to report what they're doing. Obviously, there was still lots of problems with it, and over the years, with the most recent update being the Saber-Oxley Act that came through to improve the information quality in these standard reports. But it's those standard reports and the quarterly reports that come with it, and all the rules and regulations around it, which basically enable the financial market. Without good quality information, without the regulation to ensure that the information is reported as close to true as possible, the financial markets would not work. We would end up with a market for lemmings, as Akoff would say, sort of like, because there's too much information asymmetry. And one of the big problems within the environmental ESG space is the fact that at the moment, what we do is there's no real standardized reporting, essentially companies go off and say, hey, we're doing awesome. So we know we've got a problem when ExxonMobil saying they're doing great things for the environment in their standard annual reports. You've got a problem. How do you address the information asymmetry that's occurring? How do you hold organizations and other things to account? The other problem too, markets work through standardization. Right. Every company that's listed on the equities market is standardized in terms of the information reporting, and the public invest into equities. Or debt-based products are standardized. That's why you've got slightly different names for things, all the different types of fixed income products, from government treasuries right down to junk bonds or corporate paper and related things. The point being is that standardized. Derivatives have become more and more standardized over the last couple of decades as well, so that they can be traded. But the ESG space lacks that standardization. And part of the reason for that is that ESG related, so ESG being environmental and social governance related concerns, are hyper-local. So every intervention that you're trying to do, every program, whether it's an education program or what I was talking to Yoram about with Regen Ag, they are complex things and they are very specific to a local condition. And so how do you pull data together in a way that standardizes, and so we can compare two investments, two programs in two different locations. They may be in the education space, but they may be in completely different countries with different institutions, different cultural backgrounds and those sort of things. And so a lot of, for example, this is amplified through the points of things like the WTO and the globalization is really an effort to standardize and make various different things in the world legible so that it can then be traded and flipped and moved around and compared one to the other. The environmental space and the social space do not have those sort of things at the moment. The closest we've got is the impact management platform work, which is relatively new in terms of categorizing data and trying to come up with standardized reports.
Yeah, and by the way,
yeah, sorry.
We don't have all of that, and this is the problem in the world, right? Because we produce based on financial only, and we don't take care of nature. We don't calculate nature and people. So this is why we are where we are today. Yeah, and then eventually, you know, the penultimate sort of goal, really, in many respects, is if you look at how the financial markets themselves have developed over time, we're now getting into a position in the last 15 years or so, but more recently, where we're getting a lot of what are referred to as ETFs, electronic traded funds. So you've effectively got to a situation where people can now invest passively. They can just go and invest in an ETF and not really have to make active choices about stocks or anything else like that. They can do that because underneath the hoods, there's this whole machinery that surfaces the data up in a certain way, in a certain form factor that it can then be basically invested in passively. That's the result of you know, standardizing and putting on all this machinery, which is massive, to actually achieve that. Okay, and now what you're getting within a lot of the EFT related passive funds is they're starting to do what are called either positive or negative screening. So they're saying, hey, we won't invest in bad companies, that's negative screening, or we'll go out and try and invest in positive, you know, programs and those sort of things. So to enable that to happen, there's people have got to basically do all the sort of steps in between to say, hey, this information's good, and we'll bridge it all up, and then eventually, you know, we'd be able to say, let's invest in, Robert on the street can happily and confidently invest in this business, right? And yeah, for a lot of people at the moment, they're cynical, and there's lots of scams, not just at the bottom tier, but also at the top tier. People can't trust whether someone's doing greenwashing or not, or genuine. So there's a lot of noise in the market and stuff like that. So ultimately, all of this boils down to the veracity and quality of the data that gets put in, garbage in, garbage out. How can we incentivize really good quality data collection, reporting over our activities? And again, for me, this is, we spoke about it a lot, this is really the center. And if I look, and tell me what you think about that, if we look on the services we offer to the community, so we offer a platform where all the NGOs can come on board, get some kind of verification, and basically come in to kind of get tools to basically follow the traceability and transparency, right? So how much money they got, what is the use of the funds exactly, and then what's the impact that this fund is generated. So providing these tools to the NGOs will start monitoring the information that you mentioned, and then you can start actually include them in the calculation. Imagine if you have thousands of NGOs like that, you can start really doing the calculation of that. And then on the other side, connect it to rewards, donations, SPO rewards, NFTs, and so on. Does that make sense? So really the core of Littlefish is to build this platform that creates this auditable, transparent information of the NGOs and bring it to the blockchain. Does that make sense?
I think Oscar had a good point. Maybe we should run through the business model canvas just to understand what's our value proposition, who are key stakeholders, what's our key activities, who are key partners.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like one of the greatest books, the business model generation, that goes through how to use the business model canvas and build it out. I think without having that at least high level understanding amongst ourselves, like what are our channels, how do we communicate with our customers, who are our customers, it'll be really hard to understand some of the tokenomics bit. And maybe that's a great launching pad to go into the platform canvas, because I'm sure it builds on top of all of those kind of things, but adds more of the tokenomics bits.
Yeah, the platform economics is looking at multi-sided markets effectively. So that's what the term platform is, as opposed to just a single business model within a sort of one sort of line, which is the BMC. Joe's also working on something that she's been distilling a lot of the different types of canvases that have emerged out of there, such as the lean canvas and the platform design one, into something that's more suitable about communities. So she's taking Ostrom's 8 or 13 actually design principles to help try and design that. And so she's been working on that as part of a Fund 6 proposal. So that's something also worthwhile helping out and looking at.
Could you send some links regarding that so we can follow up on that?
I'm not sure if Joe's released any links or anything else at this point in time, but I can certainly ask her and flip them across to Yoram or others. But she's been asking for input and stuff like that, so it might be a good way to work on those sort of things. But I would suggest that you also do it in stages, such as Nori is recommending. Take something that's well understood, which is the BMC or the lean canvas, if you want to go from a technology standpoint. Get familiar with the classifications and thinking about stuff. What is your revenue model? What is your cost base? Those sort of things. And then moving in, like Nori has indicated, into the platform design toolkit, which looks at more the interactions that are occurring in a platform like Littlefish. And then Joe's work would bring in some of the ideas of building out a commons.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Need to do some more on that. Yeah. Any other questions or thing? We are at the hours. I don't know, Robert, also if you still some last questions.
Well, if you have the time, I'd love to ask just one more question. So if we wanted to build this correctly, but still like go on to the main net in incremental steps, as in, let's say we decided that the donation thing is the core of what we want to do. We want to do it first. Let's get that out there. And then let's build the ecosystem around it. Is there a process by which we can do it? Or does it have to, like, we have to conceive of the entire thing, at least the entire thing that we want to build out, and then build it out all at once?
I think that would be a mistake to do later, because there's a huge amount of learning involved. And you're going into a space now where we've got this technology that really no one really knows how to use, and let alone necessarily implement with it. And that's not just Cardano, that's the whole blockchain sort of space. And not only that, you're complicating it further by saying we're going into the impact related space, which itself is complex. So if you try to design everything up front, you're guaranteed to be wrong. So in terms of trying to find a path through to do things incrementally with the view that it is incremental, that you're not going out to try and say, hey, we're solving the world's problems, but this is what we're working on, and trying to work on implementing these aspects to try and understand what's going on. That's the best approach. So, for example, we've got, whether this gets funded or not in Fund 7, I don't know, but there is the retroactive funding experiment work that we put up, which is very much predicated on this. How can we do things to learn? Because there is so much complication in this whole space, we need to do things incrementally. And so part of that proposal up on Fund 7 is really to do lots of little experiments as close to the thing so we can try and understand what's going on. So the big chunk of the ask in that proposal is actually to fund small experiments. And I'd expect or hope that we keep doing that sort of thing over and over before we get to main chain scalable kind of solutions. And by then, not only have I learned and my team learned, but the community of Catalyst or the Littlefish community has also learned what that actually means. And that's the key thing here. View it as a learning journey, that you're trying to challenge your assumptions. And I actually just, that's a key point. I think a lot of the work that has been done within the lean startup movement is very applicable here. So the idea of like the lean canvas or the business model canvas, if you want to use that, the idea of innovation accounting is very relevant, as Mira put up in his lean startup books. The idea of customer development that Steve Blank has developed are all very, very relevant here. They just need to be viewed in an impact lens. And I don't think a great deal of interpretation, because basically impact related things is innovation. You're actually trying to move systematic change. You're trying to bring something new to a market. So a lot of the thinking in the technology startup space is applicable here.
Yeah, I love it. Any last question, anyone?
Robert, I want to ask, do you know, is there any versioning system for the smart contracts? So if we release in a smart contract, can we update it in Cardano? Do you know it?
Yes, you can, if you design that in to begin with. There's nothing to say you can't. This is the idea that you can go through conversion steps, but it's essentially just something you design in from the beginning. So for example, a simple way to do things at the moment might be, let's issue a native token under a policy that has, say, multi-signature things, where you can then actually, we're going to say as a normative statement, we write it out, that we're going to convert this thing at some point in time, but this is the process that will make the decision. And we'll convert this into something else that might be a smart contract based stuff. Right? So yeah, and there's also nothing, for example, to say we can do things on the testnet. So the idea, for example, in the retroactive funding experiment work is not to do it on the main chain, do it on the testnet. In this case here, the proposer becomes the treasury, the small mini treasury, and we'll do things manually. I'm always a big advocate of working out what you need to do up front through like manual intervention, manual tasks, trying to figure it out before you jump to code and work these things out. Yeah. Even though that's a lot less sexier, a lot less, it seems slower, those sort of things. But what you're doing is actually building up knowledge and amongst everyone that's participating, and you're more likely to be successful.
Thank you. So how do you decide the initial token amount when creating a token? Is there something that we should follow, or we just decide?
No, I think that can be completely arbitrary if you want it. One of the things to keep in mind within the Cardano environment is that if you issue tokens in a policy, you can add more or you can burn more later. So you've got a degree of flexibility there. It's managing expectations around what your community is and being clear about what you're doing. It's important.
Thank you.
Good. I mean, it was amazing. Again, we learned a lot, and I think when you read the first time and even the second or third time, some of the concepts need to go deeper and learn them. Really impressive. Thank you very much for coming. One sentence that I take from Melanie. There are some sentences we take with us along, like climate change is a fellow cooperation. So one sentence I will take from you is that if you want to change the world, you need to change the accounting. And so that's your sentence, and it's going to go with us among many other things. Yeah, Melanie is here. And yeah, I mean, thank you very much. I don't want to take more for your time, but thank you really very much for coming Monday morning and sharing with us your knowledge and experience.
Believe me, I could talk about this for a long time. I'm more than happy to, because this sort of stuff is basically what I'm doing, you know, in terms of social and environmental impact. That's why I'm working on everything I'm doing, and have been for the last 4 years or so, 5 years. So the more I can spread the love, spread the word about this technology and how to use it, the better, because I can't do it all myself. So, you know, I need collaborators.
So we are lucky to have you and share this knowledge. And yeah, I mean, I think this community definitely of Littlefish definitely wants to do a lot of good in the world. And yeah, so thank you for that.
Yeah, more than happy to discuss things. And I've only touched anything I've talked about, I'm more than happy to drill into in any sort of areas. So Joe and I in particular are really passionate about the multi-capital accounting work and driving that through, because that does hit to the core of what I think is necessary, which is change the profession of value measurement, which is accounting.
This is really the key, this and the auditability again of the of information. I mean, that's getting the right information.
Yeah, and if we get funded for the retroactive funding experiment out of Fund 7, I've put in that particular proposal to do lots of mini experiments, and specifically said I want them in the climate and environmental space. So, you know, I think about, I can't quite remember how much, but about 50% or slightly more of that is the set aside to fund small experiments in the order of about $3,000 so that people can learn. There's also a bit of strategic play going on here. My co-proposer in that is highly connected into big finance in the sense of coming from Morgan Stanley, Gates Foundation, and other. She's an impact investor, and she's hooked in with Gates, Morgan Stanley, and Temasek, which is the big sovereign wealth fund in Singapore. And she's wanting to learn and understand how to use this stuff for impact related work. So the more people I can get to help us out on that, the better, because you know, that will then start to unlock significant capital flows into impact related investment. Well, that's the plan, at least.
Exciting.
Do you have a do you have like a Discord or some sort of channel to stay updated on those topics?
Sorry, not at the moment, because I'm trying to focus on implementation work and just do small things rather than big community building. So it's hard enough to explain all of this to people in the space, let alone software developers and things that are trying to get their head around all of this.
We opened up a topic for you in the Cardano for Climate Discord. Could you make use of that?
Yeah, sure. But, as I say, at the moment, I'm seriously trying to minimize the amount of social time, because I'm also fully occupied in the Eastern Town Hall and nudging everyone and getting all that ticking along as well.
So it would just be more announcements, just keeping us abreast of what's going on. If you need an audience, you need us to show up at an event, you need us to experiment with, we could be there.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that'd be great.
That'd be great. And we will sort of try to build things out. And if anyone is interested in anything I've discussed, please reach out to me and just say, hey, you know, be interested in helping out in some way. What, you know, this is what I can do. As far as I'm concerned, we're doing it, the UMI stuff as a DAO. There's a much bigger associated vision than I've even sort of articulated here. And we will be building people out. I'm just conscious of time and focus and stuff at the moment as we sort of start to crank the wheel to move things along. So that's the only reason. Otherwise I'd be in the climate Discord and doing things and
let us
and
do
attending
that work.
meeting.
Yeah, let us do that work for you. Topic, give me a topic for it. I'm going to go in and start a new topic, and we can also put this recording in there. Any kind of, you know, any kind of information you want to send our way, you just let us know, you know, an event or whatever.
So I think trying to find what a topic might be. I've tried out social and environmental investing or finance. So I've done played around with the term called SoFi, which is similar to the notion of real fi that Charles and John were sort of pushing around, but the idea being here for social and environmental investing finance. So you would have seen, I think, Melanie, a challenge proposal I put up in Fund 6 to try and push that idea. Because ultimately what we are talking about here is finance. This is allocating society's resources to the place where it's best needed, most needed. And that's what finance is. It's taking in society's resources, which are referred to as cash, flowing that, i.e. cash flow, under, which means time, we're under uncertainty or risk. We don't know whether something's going to work or not. So that's what finance does. So let's focus it on things like social and environmental efforts.
So can we call it SOEFI? Is that what you used?
I usually just go SoFi. SOFI was the term I was using, and I don't know if that resonates.
I noticed that Sosha uses Sophie. That's the name of his daughter in a stake pool. So if we did something like SOEFI with a dash, it's a place to begin.
You mentioned multi-capital accounting several times. Would that be like an umbrella term for some of this?
So yeah, multi-capital accounting, the term R3, I don't know if you're familiar with R3 org or not, I'll put it in. Go through and read some of their blueprints and stuff like that. And the R3 actually stands for Redesign, Resilience and Regeneration, which is what R3 is, but that's focused on accounting and reporting. Have a read through some of their blueprints that might give you a lot of food for thought in terms of thinking about different aspects. The key idea within finance is ratios. Everything in finance deals with ratios, where you're comparing two things to come together. And reporting 3.0 is moving towards the notion of ratios as well. We've got to deal with ratios, not scalars. Okay. And while I've talked, I'll just drop this one. While I've talked about bonding curves, which is the relationship between two things, what I'm really after is bonding surfaces, which is the relationship between multiple things. Okay. Hence the multi-capital accounting.
Wow.
Yeah.
A lot of food for thought.
Yeah.
And essentially, we've got a bookkeeping layer that can handle multi-capital accounting and bookkeeping. Now we've got to build an accounting system over the top.
Yeah,
So
I check out, I share with you a company here called Concern, which is kind of doing ESG. They're basically integrating all the ESG rating companies and individuals into one platform. So you got Nestle get, I don't know, 50 ESG rating of different people, and then you have an average. So, and that's kind of become something more and more important. Quite interesting company, I know them well. I don't know if that can be kind of, it's not a specific accounting, but it can be a measurement. It's another important measurement based on which investors invest in the company or not, right? Like funds and pension funds and so on. But who makes the calculation and so on? So they basically they take 100 different evaluators and they say, okay, even if one is skewed, you'll still have 99 that are not, and then you get kind of the right average. But it's a question of what you check, right? Because Nestle, I mean, for every reasonable person, you know that it's one of the most terrible companies in the world, but it will still get high in rating. So by most evaluators, so it depends what you evaluate.
Yeah, so there's a lot I could talk about in that, so I won't.
Yeah.
But I think, so there's a whole lot of work going on at the top end, you know, with big capital, those sort of things, the big push, like BlackRock and some of the other big hedge funds and stuff like that have started to split out for ESG related funds and things like that. But I am of the view that you kind of need to come from the bottom up and develop that, because it's one thing. In the Eastern Town Hall, there was a wonderful, wonderful session a few months ago where I asked everyone in there why Cardano. And there was a woman in there called Charity from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she's been educating a whole lot of women for the last 10 years and trying to lift their boat and, you know, trying to lift their skills and their confidence and everything else like that. And she said, you know, why Cardano? And her basic argument was that we have to change the mindset. We have to change the mindset from aid to capability. So much of the approach to solving problems within, say, the developing countries is orientated towards aid. We throw the aid in, we'll tell you what to do, we'll tell you how to do it. So we've got the ability to know and understand what we can do, how, in our local conditions and our local environments. Let us do that. So she was really, I mean, she articulated it a lot better than I just did there, but that was the heart of it, was we've got to change the paradigm from building capability, or from aid to building capability. And it was a wonderful, wonderful statement that she was making around exactly the problems. And so that's where I think what's so important here is we've got to be able to change things at the bottom up. And in some respects, what I'm trying to do with the work in the retroactive funding and some of the other stuff I haven't talked about is close the gap between the two, which puts it in to what we're doing to do that. And some of the work I did early, about 4 or 5 years ago, was related to this notion of social policy payments here in New Zealand, which was really trying to change the narrative from a cost basis for the public taxpayer to an investment basis. We're investing in the forward fiscal opportunities of our citizens in the country here. And that required detailed local administrative data, which could not be held by the government. So how did you architect the system to achieve that? It's a similar sort of aim here. So Nori, in answer to your question, is like, yes, multi-capital accounting. I'm just looking on the R3 here, and there's a thing from multi-capitalism to, from monocapitalism to multi-capitalism. Is that the positioning? Is that the subtext? You know, those sort of things. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Definitely. Thanks for that link. I didn't know about r3.org, so I'm going to spend some time going through their blueprints. They look really fascinating.
Yeah. Joe's quite heavily involved in that group as well, Jo Allen. So you'll know her. So she's doing quite a bit there. Okay.
Can you put in a good word for us to get Joe over whenever we can. She's
Oh,
part
absolutely.
of us. Yeah, she's part of us, but maybe we just don't time it right, you know, to get her at events and meetings and stuff. But yeah, just say hi for us.
Right. So Joe is part of what we're doing here, you know, obviously. So absolutely, she can drop in on those sort of times and things like that. The challenge we face being plus 13 of UTC is at the moment, I'm kind of got meetings chucked up at the beginning of the morning and then meetings at the end going into sort of like 12 o'clock, and it's exhausting. So I've been sort of trying to unwind those a little bit. And I think she's similar on that side.
Joe is amazing, and we are also using a sentence of Joe a lot. So we are who we have been waiting for, right? So, and so that's a memorable one.
She turned me on to a book called Better Work Together through the Inspire.
Right.
It's
so
stuff.
So we work, Alana, who's one of the key authors on that. Obviously, I know quite a lot of the people that co-authored that book and from Inspiral. Yeah. In fact, the lawyer for Inspiral was on my team. So there you go.
Yeah, it's like the whole world is slowly waking up and trying to build better systems. So it's fascinating to see what everyone's doing.
Yeah. That's cool. So hopefully that's given you some food for thought. I'm more than happy. This is actually quite a good time. 7 p.m. UTC is quite a good time for me. It's about 8 o'clock in the morning, so it's not horrendous to get up. So I'll try, if these are your regular sort of weekly meetings, I'll try and drop in from time to time. Just remind me.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Yes, amazing. Melanie, you summarize everything and there is a test, right?
Absolutely. Yep. I'm guaranteed to fail.
Yeah.
Sorry. Time.
Yeah.
Which is you said it's that risk-adjusted bonding curves are a way, with the markets, are a way to make decisions, right? So is there maybe, I don't know, a rule of thumb or some way to determine which decisions should be made by voting compared to risk using the market for that?
Right. So there's a whole lot of different market mechanisms to do things like price discovery or price formation. So that's one camp. Then there's a whole group around social choice sort of works, like different forms of voting to reveal preferences. They all have, different trade-offs. So is there a sort of guiding rule of thumb? No, I don't think there is in particular. It's something you've got to learn and evolve and try and understand. What I will say is this, is that we, in the blockchain environment, we're in an environment where it's very difficult to identify an individual, right? We're working in a extrajudicial sort of environment across the globe. And we can't necessarily know, the term here is often Siebel. We can't do the sort of the Siebel attack side of things. And a lot of the social choice stuff rely on some notion of strong identity. So that is like, one person, one vote type of situation. And unfortunately, if you get into a strong identity notion, you're immediately excluding a lot of people straight away, because a lot of systems in the world, people don't even have basic birth certificates. And then, of course, you get into the problem of collecting information that I think, like the failure in Afghanistan recently, and the fact that the Taliban there were able to get all the biometric information of people that had helped people out with the US efforts over there, now has put them in a precarious position. So these sort of things is really, really difficult. So in those sort of situations, you should try and avoid, my view is you should try and avoid things like one person, one vote. You should try and avoid strong identity, which then means that you'll gravitate more towards sort of market-based mechanisms to try and do that, where you've got strategic intent, because the whole premise of a market is you don't know who the individual agents are. You've got this abstract model where they're rational, they're making choices out of self-interest, those sort of things. Yeah, okay. But literally the notion of markets for good is using market mechanisms is important. Has anyone come across the radical exchange work and radical markets? I'll send that into the chat as well if you haven't. I'd encourage you to look up at a lot of what is being done there. And if you haven't read the book called Radical Markets, then go over and read that. And so if there's a parting thing in reference to your comments, Simon, is don't be afraid of markets. The key trick here is, can we use market speculative behavior to actually do good? And that's what I think we can do with things like the risk-adjusted bonding curve. And given that a lot of this blockchain space is about token flipping and greed and things like that, don't fight it. Let's see if we can channel it into for good purposes. That's kind of my thinking about this. And more broadly, the notion of profit is the notion of progress. So if we can expand progress makes no statement about whether it's good or bad. It just means we're moving in some particular direction. We're making a profit. So can we actually expand on that to direct it to what we think is socially or environmentally good?
Thanks.
And so that radical market stuff goes into things like, you'll be familiar with quadratic voting. That's kind of where, this is where that came from. There's also things like the Harbinger tax or cost, which is another kind of idea, which is a really interesting one to explore within the NFT space. And there's various other things in there. This book was basically a provocation. The radical markets community or radical exchange community has gone beyond that into sort of civic infrastructure. So their focus, admittedly, on the board is Vitalik. So, obviously a lot of focus, like with the token engineering commons work on Ethereum, but that's loosening up, and we can build bridges into those communities. So just looking on their homepage, I had a long session with Audrey not long ago, and Matt and a few others in there. Making those bridges. And so Kendrick, who's doing the vote of diversity into, out of Cardano around voting there. We're just having a small discussion with some of the people on Radical Exchange around quadratic voting and quadratic funding. Yeah. The downside with things like quadratic voting is it needs a notion of strong identity, otherwise it descends towards one token, one vote. It doesn't handle Siebel resistance particularly well. Something like the risk-adjusted bonding curve or things like conviction or commitment voting, which can be used as the basis for those are bonding curves, can better handle things like Siebel, they're more Siebel resistant. Anyway, I can go on about this stuff on, so please stop me.
Yeah, but I don't know, I don't have any more questions, unfortunately. Anyone else?
Notice how nobody's stopping you, Robert.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to not give a complete brain dump. Conscious of everyone's mental capacity and the time and things, so please.
I've already
How many? Yeah, sorry.
I was just saying, I've already bought 2 books based on what you've recommended and dropped there. So
There you go. I can point you to a lot more. Yeah. So what I wouldn't mind just having a little talk about something I'm doing here in New Zealand as well, which is related, because I saw in the Littlefish stuff that you're talking about NFTs. If you're interested in that, I can just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little context of New Zealand, Aotearoa, which is small country, you know, away from everywhere else. We've got a bit of a moat around us, which is great. But what is unique about New Zealand with respect to other Western countries, particularly ones which have, you know, would be considered wealthy. And first of all, we're high degree of trust in the government, probably one of the lowest countries with corruption and basically non-existent. But we also have a unique situation, which is that in a sense, the country is supposed to be at least co-governed by the Crown, which is what we refer to as the New Zealand government is at the moment, but it was actually referred to up until about the 1960s as the settler government. And because this was the colonial Crown, British coming in, doing their thing. And the other partner in that is Maori, or the indigenous population. Now I'm Maori, so this is similar to the North American tribes, Indian tribes, and pretty much similar sort of indigenous populations around the globe. It's a tribal-based society. So here in New Zealand, we've got an interesting situation where we've got the Western notion of individual as prime, and also the collective notion of tribe, which we refer to as hapu and iwi, depending on the levels you go to. Now, this is actually baked into our notional constitution, which is referred to as the treaty. And as a result, we've got this notion of partnership between the Crown and Maori. So this introduces a notion of co-governance, both at that macro level, but also Maori itself is a polycentric tribal-based society made up of many tribes, many centres of decision-making. And it views the world in terms of holistic, rather than the individual reductionist. We are not, as humans, we are not above nature, we are part of nature. And that's very much embodied into a lot of the cultural practices and things that we do. So for example, my ancestors, which are referred to as tipuna, are a mountain, for example. So my penultimate, my uber sort of ancestor is Mount Taranaki. And that has personhood status in New Zealand. So legal personhood status. It has the notion of guardianship or kaitiakitanga, which is that there's the people that regard Taranaki as their ancestor is given guardianship over that. And such that if you go and do environmental damage and stuff on Taranaki, you can actually be criminally charged for assault. That sort of level or sort of thing. And it applies also to rivers and things around that. This is part of negotiating all the different types of situations that this co-governance and tribal-based holistic worldview versus the Western notion of individualism comes together. As a result of that, it introduces lots of really interesting things around governance, and also more broadly the notion kaitiakitanga and the idea that you have muri, or what is referred to as a life force, is in everything. And these are pervasive through the tribal societies and the culture, and more of New Zealand is adopting these sort of practices. Indeed, most New Zealand organisations are actually starting to adopt this notion of mātauranga Māori, which is basically to incorporate in their governance practices notions of holistic worldview and reporting. We're not perfect, we're a long way off, but the trajectory is such that we're doing that. So as a result of that, one of the key things that we have behind in Māori is we're coming up against a lot of tension, is how to protect property rights in a collectivist organisations. So how do you protect and preserve Māori culture, and also these notions of data and Māori data sovereignty? And so because first of all, there's one, it's collectivist, so that you can't identify an individual, but also from a property rights point of view, it's not time bound, because my identity is formed by my relationship to the land as much as it is to my relationship with other people in my tribe and my family. Okay, so the narratives and stuff that come from it is really, really important. I argue and I believe that a lot of the practices and principles inside of Mātauranga Māori, which is basically the whole idea of governance and co-governance, is applicable to a lot of the stuff we're trying to figure out now, both in terms of environmental aspects, but also to DAOs generally, and new forms of organizational structure. So within that context, we're trying to do some things. How do we get people thinking about this and working? And obviously, as a colonized peoples, there's a big distrust with respect to the Crown and what they do, because again, much like I was talking about with Charity, where she was talking about aid versus give us the capability. A lot of the situations or a lot of the systems that have been put in or done are often done to manage the Indigenous population, not build capability in the Indigenous population. So there's a lot of distrust around doing that. But in also doing so, progressively, Māori organisations generally are expected to be around about 20 to 30% of the New Zealand's economy in the next few years. So not insignificant, quite large. So I have been working on a project that we've got funded by the government to actually try and start making progress on how to bring the notions of Mātauranga Māori into collective governance and incorporate into an extrajudicial sort of IP system around that sort of work. And we've been doing that along with the Waikato University, which I'll just, Kotahi Research Centre, and they're doing some, what is referred to as tikana, tikana in Māori, or in technology, sorry. Tikana is Māori law or customary laws. And that's kind of like these sort of practices and rituals and things like that. And so the bigger question here is, how do you transpose what are typically practices and processes and ways of thinking in the physical world? How do you represent those in digital environments? And these are very similar to sort of discussions around how do we build collectives and DAOs? How do we work together more effectively? How do we redistribute value? All of those sort of things coming through. So anyway, we've been funded to do some work around that with the Ministry of Culture and Heritage to bring the bonding curves to Mātauranga Māori and more progressive in the longer term, a risk-adjusted bonding curves to Mātauranga Māori as a way to start to get collective ownership over Māori cultural products and to co-govern the use of data more generally. So there's a group that I'm part of, which is called the Māori Data Sovereignty Group. And so my hope is threefold really, is that one, we learn how to do this tikana into technology and transition that. two, we open the doors with our regulators here, the IRD and the Financial Market Authority, because in some respects they're actually required to be partners in Maori. So they can't turn me away on the basis of, no, this is just financial product, go fit in over here. They actually have to try and work with us. And so what I'm hoping is that we can open the door and have a serious and really constructive conversation around how to do disclosures and reporting on matters that concern Mātauranga Māori, which is fundamentally these ESG related concerns, social and environmental reporting concerns. And that also fits in with the Treasury, which has been doing all the wellbeing framework. So I've got an answer to help make the wellbeing framework and the wellbeing budgets and the living standards framework more tangible. And on the third component is obviously to help us learn more broadly about how to do that, taking in Indigenous knowledge. So that's known as tomo, which means to enter into an agreement or enter a marriage. And that's work that's has been funded, and hopefully I'll talk a little bit more about it at the town hall or something else like that later, some other time in the future.
Oh, amazing.
I find it so interesting that your government is already getting involved with bonding curves. And like pretty much everyone else just doesn't know what cryptocurrency is.
Yeah. So that is the interesting thing here, that I've managed to broker in effect with 3 universities here in the country, 3 government departments, and generally Maori to work on their things. They don't quite know what's going to hit them.
That gives me so much hope that government can be actually good. It also makes me super jealous.
Mm-hmm. I also love the thought that mountains and other things can have sovereign identity. So like if we had that here in Canada, then Teal Jones could be taken to court for assault against the ancient forest. And I think that way of thinking about the interconnectedness of everything and having rights to these things that we normally think of as objects, as rivers or mountains or forests, is an amazing development. And I would love to know more about that. Just like, how do we get to that in Canada or in the United States or other places in the world where you have Indigenous populations as well as colonial settler?
We're also, Joe and I are also working on something just at the moment, which is, so I've been working on something called the Data Commons, which was, we also have this thing called Predator Free 2050. So in New Zealand, for example, have anyone heard of the Allbirds shoes? Have you come across Allbirds shoes? They're made out of the merino. Anyway, they're called Allbirds because New Zealand used to be all birds. There was no mammals or pests or anything else like that. So we have this weird thing of flightless birds and parrots that don't fly and things like that, because they had no predators for a long time. And so there's a big initiative across the country to try and reduce the number of mammalian and general pests in the country as much as possible. And that's known as Predator Free 2050. And so there's a huge program across the country to try and do that. And then there's something like 4,000 community groups that are doing things like weeding and trapping and all sorts of stuff going on. But like most things, you've got people who are, environmental pioneers. They're really activists. They're really trying to change things, but they may be technically illiterate in the sense that most of the data is collected and on paper. You might be doing well to get it onto a spreadsheet, those sort of things. So how do you build tools and technology to collect that data to measure progress? That was a key idea. We're taking a chunk of that work that we did it several years ago and building on top of the Tomo work for a local hapu here called Ngāti Hangarau, which Joe's partner is a member of. And we've got a large block of land up here, which they're trying to preserve. And like mountains, Nori, trees are also considered our ancestors, particularly the really long-lived ones, the kauri, the rimu, which are really huge trees and things like that, and obviously got cut down during colonialism, but there's still a lot of big ones. So we're literally going around trying to identify the trees and care for them and replant them, replant space, measure things like the water quality, those sort of things. And discussing around indexes that can be useful for that. So one of my favorite is something called the Tuna Index, which is, tuna is a eel, brown eel in New Zealand. And when I was growing up as a kid, you know, it was a staple diet. I'd go down to the river, catch some eel, we'd go off and smoke them, and that would be part of the marae's, you know, meetings or anything else like that. And so progressively, as New Zealanders moved in towards industrialized farming, the water quality is lowered. And so it's affecting these eels. So this is a good example of a very relatable metric. Can you increase the number of eels that are eaten in a wharekai because you've increased the water quality? The environment overall has got a lot better. And so we refer to that as the Tuna Index. That's a way of making it a metric culturally relevant. And there's a few others like that. So,
very interesting.
So we're doing that sort of work as well. We've got cash for the next 4 years to do that sort of work. And so we'll build upon some of the things we're doing there, hopefully. See how it goes. Anyway, we've been on for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Nearly.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Yeah, thank
no
you.
problem. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
I think
Robert.
you all got a lot of education from you. We got a lot to think about, a lot to work on, and we'll probably keep in touch and get your feedback on our future work if it's at all possible.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah, we're all trying to do the same thing. So, yeah, so we can pull it all together. So I'm kind of using purely out of necessity or access to things. I'm using my own country and my own local environment as my lab to experiment. Is a way to think about it. But these ideas and the thinking behind it, I see no reason why it can't scale globally, and that's the idea here.
Good to have you.
Yeah,
Really.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
No problem. So I will leave you now, yeah? Unless there's anything else you wanted to ask me.
So the Discord channel just did get started, Robert. If you want to, I put the link in the chat. Already started, and you can drop anything you want in there. It's open source, community controlled. Nobody's gonna say, no, you can't do it. So you can do it.
Okay, yeah. I'll
And,
do my
Robert,
best.
whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Sorry, Dimitri, go.
Yeah, just wanted to say, whenever you're ready, you are wanting mini projects to do your experimentation. So I have a couple of projects. You're welcome to use them for your experiment.
Yeah, so what I wouldn't mind is, how we go about selecting those will be interesting. So I think I've specified it at being roughly around a target funding amount of about 3,000 US. TIVA is going to do a sort of mini workshops and things like that. And the objective here is to really kind of help everyone learn. So, and how we select some of the initial projects. We've got to take it easy. We've got to manage the expectations. Those projects, key criteria here is that we don't want to be safe in those projects. As in, like, we don't want them all to succeed. Because the whole idea of the retroactive funding is we only pay on success. If we go in and figure out, hey, all of these things are going to work, then we're not learning anything new and we don't need the risk adjusted bonding curve. Right? So I'd be really interested in, if assuming we do get funded, it was pretty highly rated, to start thinking about how we select those projects, what shape do they take, and I think that learning will be 100% relevant to Littlefish. Right. So if you don't mind, I'll definitely reach out if it's funded. We won't be doing it immediately. We'll be looking at probably starting at about 3 or 4 months, but partly because there's a certain amount of work to do to help people understand what this thing is actually about and how to think about the experiments to begin with before we actually get into doing them. Okay. And
that's fine, Robert. I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, Robert.
I'll do a thing on the Discord about it if it gets funded.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure listening to you.
No, thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll see you. I'm going to go and grab a coffee and get on with my day.
See you later.
See ya.
Bye.
Wow. Lots of information for us to work.
Yeah. See you in a couple of years as I digest it all.
You know what? We're in this for the long term, right? We've got a 10-year goal of making climate change part of our history, not something that we have to be afraid of. So, you know, this is a beginning, and it feels like, oh, you know, we should be able to jump in and do this, you know, right now, like everybody else, and get it done. But if we're going to do it right, we have to squash that FOMO, and we have to get it right, because this is going to be foundational for what comes into the future. We're changing the future because of this, and it will take time. So, wow.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, and we have lots of work to do. So, do we have anything in our agenda, Chakan?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do to really start building out stuff, but I think we've already had like 2 hours. So maybe check. Maybe I'll drop something in Discord and we can talk over that. But just a summary, what I wanted to do was start building out those maps. I was thinking about building the systems map of Littlefish, but I think starting with the business canvas model is also fine. Let's just start understanding. So I just wanted to set up a meeting that we can gather most of us and then just start working on it.
Yeah, I already put canvas model in the Miro board. There are different versions, but I think they are similar to each other, and we can start with that.
Yeah, so during the week, let's just set up a date that we can all meet and start working on it.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Sounds good.
Good to see you all.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
hosting.
See you all.
See you guys.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.